Hi, thanks for tuning in. This is the US Futures Weekly Chart Analysis for the week ending 30th of January 2026. The first chart is the US dollar index futures. They did move lower for the week, but the position of the close suggests an attempt to support the market. You can see the market did trade lower and really did threaten the lows overall on an increase in volume. This is pretty strong volume here, and on that, the market has not continued lower and broken down. It's attempting to hold on and perhaps recover. Buying support has emerged. We'll just have to see how strong that buying support is. This market's inferring an attempt to recover, probably up to this line here, although if the weakness does continue, you may only get to that level. But in there somewhere, you'll find an attempt to recover at least early next week, as this market did push lower and see a reasonable recovery. This was defence against supply. Whether it's going to be ongoing defence, we'll have to wait and see. But at this point, there has been an attempt to support the market. This is the E-mini S&P 500 index futures. Price really continues to trade sideways. There's no great impetus for a push higher here. The market's traded below the previous bar's close, testing for supply. It's pushed up to the highs of the range and finished the week mid-bar in equilibrium, pretty much trading sideways. Volume was just a fraction below the average, so this was genuine trading. It's not really showing you any great strength, this market. It's trading relatively sideways, and it has done for quite some time now. It would be much preferable to see the market make an attempt to really accelerate higher, because while it's going sideways like this, if there is a supply event emerge for whatever reason, the price will come down, there's no doubt. There's not enough strength in this market to push it higher, so there's not enough strength in this market to defend against some decent supply. You see the market at least come back to this level and possibly back to this level if there was some decent supply drawn out. At this point in time, supply is relatively low and price is just drifting sideways. US Treasury 10-year note futures, and they're attempting to hold on. I suggested they might last week when we saw last week's bar showing an attempt to support the market, and this week saw that continue. Prices trying to hold on at this level. I'm not sure it's going to be successful. That was a fairly narrow spread and relatively weak bar on a slight increase in volume and slightly above average volume. That was a pretty narrow spread up bar. There would have been some testing for supply early here below the previous bar's close, and then a little push higher in response. But the market's obviously found some resistance at this level here. It's probably going to find more if it continues higher up to here. So while there has been an attempt to support the market, it's a weak attempt so far, and any sign of decent supply will probably push this market down to this level. Copper price futures saw some pretty serious supply drawn out this week. That volume is really high and is a little bit suspicious to some degree. We rarely get volumes quite that high, from time to time, but on that volume, price attempt to move higher, it's failed, supply's been drawn out, and price has been pushed back to close at the previous breakout line here, which is a logical level. You'll likely see a test for supply almost certainly in response, maybe even a little shakeout. I'll draw half a test and half a shakeout in an attempt to neutralise the inferred weakness from that poorly closing upthrusty kind of bar we've got this week. That's the most likely scenario, and you may even see that for a week or two like this to attempt to neutralise the weakness that may have emerged this week. If supply continues to be drawn out, the next lower level that price had moved down to is here. At this point in time, I expect the market will produce a down bar, and the position of the close will show you how much strength or weakness is in the market. Similar in the gold price market. It was an attempt to push higher. Supply has been drawn out, and that supply has forced price lower. Volume was pretty high. I expect the market will test this breakout line for strength. It'll almost certainly test for supply below the previous bar's close to some degree in an attempt to stabilise and neutralise the weakness that may have been drawn out this week. If there's ongoing weakness, you'll probably see price come back to these sort of levels in here. And if weakness is found to be low almost immediately, or that weakness has been absorbed or bought by the buyers in the market, following some testing for supply in the first part of the week, if it's established that supply is low now, you may see the market attempt to move higher later in the week. But you'll almost certainly get some testing for supply early in the week, below the previous bar's close, to establish just how much supply is in the market and continues to be drawn out. The narrower the spread, or the more shallow the pullback is, the stronger the market will be, because the market will pull back, no doubt. If it's only a shallow and relatively brief pullback before the buyers regain control, this market will probably push higher fairly quickly, probably later in the week. If it's a deep pullback, right back to, say, this level, and it lasts all week, then price is probably going to trade sideways for a period in consolidation mode, probably in there. Silver price futures, always a little more volatile than the gold price futures, and they were again this week. You'll see the market did pull back pretty much to the logical level, the previous breakout line. Maybe a slight overshoot there, but not by much. So it was a logical level. Volume was very high. It was an attempt to move higher. Supply was drawn out. Price was pushed lower. The close was back pretty close to the logical level, the previous breakout line. So that's all pretty good. You'll almost certainly see a test for supply to some degree in response below the previous bar's close, and then the market will trade depending on how much supply is drawn out. If supply is persistent and ongoing, you'll probably get a deeper pullback and a poorer close, and you'll probably find price will continue sideways in this range for a period to consolidate. But if supply is found to be low and price closes up at this sort of level after briefly moving lower earlier in the week, and supply is low, there may be an attempt almost straight away, like towards the end of the week, to move higher. And that would suggest that the buyers have absorbed the seller's supply and price is going to continue higher. This market, and gold in particular, and to some degree copper, have not been trading in an orthodox manner more recently. It's been a scramble for positions. So it'll be interesting to see how these three markets contend with this supply that's been drawn out. Will there be enough buyers to just absorb the supply very quickly and overcome the inferred weakness? Or will this weakness really be ongoing now for a period, and the market will need to consolidate sideways like this for a period, probably within the range of the breakout line here and the lows of that bar there? This is light crude price futures, and they continued higher this week. They certainly have confirmed that this inferred weakness on this bar was absorption and not true weakness. There was a little brief test for supply below that bar's close, and then a push higher up to the logical level. And this week, once again, a brief and shallow test for supply below the previous bar's close, and then when the coast was clear, a push up to the highs of the range. And it's a nice push. It's closed just below that important level. After challenging it just briefly here, and it's just drifted back to close in the relative safety that's found within the overall trading range. So that was a good move. You'll almost certainly see a little test for supply again below the previous bar's close, and then if supply continues to be low, there may be an attempt to challenge this level and push up to or towards the highs of the range, which are up here. I don't expect that'll happen all in 1 week, but you may find that price just continues to push higher over time, maybe testing the lows of this range prior to continuing, something like that. But it'll all start with a test for supply below this week's close, just to be sure that supply is relatively low within the range prior to any challenge to the breakout line. Into the currencies now, and with the US dollar recovering nicely and looking like it would like to make an attempt to move higher, this market traded the inverse almost exactly as you'd expect, and it's produced an upthrusty sort of bar on quite high volume. This market will almost certainly pull back to some degree, perhaps not quite that wide, and test for supply or even shake out and attempt to neutralise the weakness that may have emerged in response to this week's bar, which closed poorly. And it will depend to a large degree on what the US dollar does, and I think it's going to attempt to move higher. Whether it's a successful attempt or not is another thing, but it's going to attempt to move higher, I think, and this market will then be forced lower in response. There's a number of levels that can come back to, depending on how strong that move is. Have a look at the pound. British pound did a similar thing, obviously, to the euro. Prices attempted to move higher when the US dollar was moving lower. Then as the US dollar recovered, the close on this market moved lower. You've got an upthrusty bar on pretty high volume. This market's going to test for supply as well below this week's close. And it will also depend on what the US dollar is doing. You'll probably find this market comes back and probably settles at this level here. That would be the sensible level. If it's real strength in the US dollar, it may come back to here. That's less likely, I think. I think this is the level the market will come back to, unless the US dollar tanks again, in which case price will probably push straight back up to this level. So watching that US dollar closely, it's the key to these markets. Japanese yen currency futures, they moved up to the highs of the range. We kind of suggested they may, up to here. Then supply's been drawn out and prices closed poorly and near the lows of the week. I would expect a test for supply in response in an attempt to neutralise the weakness that may have emerged. Volume was pretty strong. You'll almost certainly see price come back and test for supply this week. Aussie dollar currency futures, they moved up to the next level higher this week, challenged that level, and then with the strength in the US dollar later in the week, prices pulled back somewhat to close below that level. This market has shown more strength than the previous three markets have for some time now. We mentioned it back here and here. There's been inferred strength in the market, and I note that it was nearly a mid-bar close in this market here this week on pretty strong volume. That suggests there is buying support in this market. It's not just weakness inferred by the US dollar. All these markets take their key movement from the US dollar, but there's also some domestic fundamental movement in there, and this market's a little stronger than weaker at the moment. So while some of those other markets, the euro and the pound, closed really low on the bar down here, this market's almost closed mid-bar, and that's showing you that there is a little extra strength in this market. You'd still expect this market to test for supply early in the week as the US dollar attempts to move higher. And depending on how much supply is actually drawn out, you'll see the response later in the week. Bitcoin futures moved lower again this week and are threatening the lows of the range. Price has dropped out of the range. Here was the lows of the range here. You've got the last gasp lows through there. Price did come back to that level and recover. Volume increased to about average, so this was genuine trading. There's no anomaly in there. It's perhaps a little heartening that there was enough buying support in the market to defend the week's lows and close just slightly off the lows and within the range of this down bar where support was found last time. So there was some attempt to defend against supply and support the market. You probably expect this market to make an attempt to move higher in response to a bar like that. It will depend on how much buying support is in the market. If this market's really weak, you may see the market just come back almost straight away. But you would expect, with the close off the week's low on an increase in volume, showing you there was some buying support in the market, you would expect some attempt to move higher in response, even if later in the week price comes back and tests the strength of the lows of the range here. So if this market's got any decent buying support in there, I would expect an attempt to move higher and perhaps regain its position above that level there and trade in here for the week. If it could do that, that would actually be a good, strong move. Get back into that range where the shaded rectangle is, showing you where support was found last time, over here. And the market consolidated. You don't really want the market trading in this level for too long. There's inferred weakness in there. You really want the market to recover, push up, and come back into this sideways range that it was trading in for some time. Okay, just back to the US dollar index futures quickly. You can see the buying support that emerged. You can see that volume increased considerably, and on that volume, the market recovered to close up near its high for the week. Buying support has certainly come into this market. I would expect an attempt to move higher. I don't know whether it'll be strong enough to recover back above this line. It may only come to this level if the market's not particularly strong. It may only come to that level. But I expect the market will attempt to move higher next week. There may be an early test for supply like this. So there may be a little test for supply in the first day or so next week, but I expect at some point an attempt to move higher. Whether it fails after that, who knows? But at this point, I expect price to move slightly higher or test for supply and then attempt to move higher up to one of these two levels. And we'll see what happens by the end of the week. Okay, thanks for your time. Back again next week. See ya.